Have you ever worked a job so hard your body ached before the sun went down? The kind of work that leaves dust in your lungs, grease under your nails, and a weight on your back that never quite goes away. But somewhere between the sweat and the exhaustion, you hummed a song. Not because you were happy, because that little melody was the only thing keeping you from falling apart. Now, hold that feeling for a moment. Because there was a man who took that exact feeling, the rhythm of tired hands, the heartbeat of a long shift, the laughter squeezed between hours of labor, and turned it into music. Music that made an entire nation sing along. Music that crossed oceans, filled dance floors, and gave millions of ordinary people permission to feel joy in the middle of their struggle. His songs played on radios from New York to California. His rhythms echoed through nightclubs in London and record shops in Tokyo. Some of the biggest names in rock, punk, and funk called him a genius. One of the most legendary bands in history chose him, a mechanic from New Orleans, to open their tour. He gave the world anthems that people still dance to, still hum in kitchens and factories and late-night bars, decades after they were recorded. He wasn't some overnight sensation propped up by a label. He was the real thing, a voice that came straight from the street, from the workshop floor, from a life lived elbow-deep in engine oil and melody. But here's the part that should make you angry. If you walked out onto any street in America today and asked 100 people his name, 99 of them would stare at you blankly, not because his music disappeared. It didn't. You've probably heard it without knowing who made it. The song was everywhere. The man behind it was nowhere. He wasn't forgotten by accident. He was chosen to be forgotten, passed over by an industry that never quite knew what to do with a man who didn't fit the mold. He wasn't dramatic enough for headlines. He wasn't tragic enough for a biopic. He was just honest, and somehow, in the music business, that was the one thing they couldn't sell. His name was Lee Dorsey, and what the industry did to him, or rather, what it failed to do for him, is one of the quietest injustices in the history of American music. Not the loudest, not the most scandalous, but maybe the most telling. Because when you erase a man who sang truth, you're not just forgetting a singer. You're saying that truth doesn't matter enough to remember. Today, we're going to fix that. This isn't a biography. This is a reckoning. I'm going to tell you the story of a man who turned hard labor into melody, who made the working class dance, and who deserved a place in history that he never received. A man who never begged for attention, never played the game, and never stopped singing, even when the world stopped paying attention. And by the end, I think you'll agree, it's time to give it back to him. So sit down, pour yourself something warm, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and give me a few minutes of your time, because Lee Dorsey gave the world everything he had. The least we can do is listen. To understand Lee Dorsey, you have to understand the place that made him. And New Orleans in the 1920s and 1930s wasn't the postcard city you see in travel brochures today. It was a city of labor, a city where black families worked from before sunrise to long after dark, hauling crates on the docks, pressing clothes in laundry rooms, laying bricks in the sweltering heat. The music that came out of those streets wasn't born from leisure. It was born from survival. Irving Lee Dorsey came into the world on Christmas Eve, 1924, in a neighborhood where nobody had much of anything except pride and rhythm. His family didn't own a piano. They didn't have a record player gathering dust in the corner. What they had was the sound of the city itself, the brass bands rolling through Sunday parades, the gospel choirs shaking the walls of wooden churches, the blues spilling out of corner bars where men drank away the weight of the week. That was Lee's first music school, not a classroom. A city that couldn't stop singing, even when it had every reason to. As a boy, he ran the same streets as another kid with big dreams, Antoine Fats Domino. The two of them soaked up the same sounds, Creole funk, gospel shouts, the loose swing of rhythm and blues before anyone gave it a name. But here's what separated their paths early. Fats found his way to a piano and a mentor. Lee found his way to a wrench and a workbench. Not because he was less talented, because that's what life handed him. And Lee Dorsey was the kind of man who worked with whatever life put in his hands. When he was around 10, his family pulled up roots and moved across the country to Portland, Oregon. Imagine that for a moment. A child raised on the warmest, loudest, most rhythmically alive city in America, dropped into the cold quiet of the Pacific Northwest. The brass bands were gone, the gumbo smell was gone. The second-line parades were a memory. Portland taught him something New Orleans never could: how to carry your identity when the world around you doesn't reflect it. How to be yourself when no one around you sounds like you, moves like you, or understands where you come from. That independence would define him for the rest of his life. As a teenager, when the United States entered World War II, Lee enlisted in the Navy. He was young, restless, and looking for purpose. The military gave him discipline, how to follow orders, how to endure, how to push through exhaustion without complaint. But it couldn't give him what he already carried inside. Somewhere between the open sea and the barracks, Lee realized that rhythm was the one thing no uniform could contain. The Navy shaped his body. New Orleans had already shaped his soul. When the war ended and he came home, life didn't roll out a red carpet. There was no stage waiting, no recording contract, no agent with a handshake and a plan. What there was rent, bills, the simple crushing reality of a young black man in post-war America trying to figure out how to eat. So Lee did what a lot of men did. He fought, literally. In the early 1950s, he stepped into the boxing ring under the name Kid Chocolate. It sounded glamorous. It wasn't. He lasted one fight, knocked out in the second round. The canvas hit his back, the lights blurred above him, and in that moment of bruised clarity, something clicked. He wasn't built for fists. He was built for something that didn't require hurting anyone. He just didn't know what it was yet. By 1955, Lee was back where he belonged, New Orleans. He opened a small auto repair garage on a side street, the kind of place where the radio was always on and the coffee was always old. He fixed engines by day. He hummed melodies under his breath while tightening bolts. Customers would come in for a brake job and leave talking about the mechanic with the golden voice. He didn't go looking for the stage. The stage came looking for him. After work, he started singing in local clubs. Nothing fancy, just a man, a microphone, and whatever band would let him sit in. He wasn't polished. He didn't have choreography or a costume. What he had was something you can't teach and can't fake: ease. His voice moved like a conversation between old friends, smooth but playful, warm but never heavy. He sang about life the way he lived it, simply, honestly, and with a wink that told you he'd been through enough to laugh at the hard parts. The late-night crowds in New Orleans started to remember his name. Word spread from bar to bar, club to club. There's a mechanic on the east side who can turn any room into a party. He recorded a few singles with local labels. They didn't chart. They didn't need to. They gave him something more valuable than fame: confidence, the quiet certainty that what he had was real. By the end of the 1950s, Lee Dorsey had already been a sailor, a boxer, a mechanic, and a singer. Each life taught him something the last one couldn't. The sea gave him discipline. The ring gave him humility. The garage gave him patience. And the music gave him the one thing he'd been searching for since childhood: a way to turn the weight of living into something that made people smile. He couldn't have known it then, but all those nights of singing to half-empty rooms and oil-stained afternoons of fixing strangers' cars were building towards something. Because soon, the man who repaired engines for a living was about to give America a song it would never forget. And America, for a little while at least, was going to love him for it. By 1960, Lee Dorsey was 35 years old. In the music industry, that's practically ancient for a debut. Most artists who make it big do so in their 20s, young, moldable, easy to market. Lee was none of those things. He was a grown man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms, a family to feed, and a voice that didn't sound like anything the charts were used to hearing. He wasn't trying to be a star. He was just trying to see if the feeling he had on those late-night stages was real enough to mean something beyond the room. It was, and someone finally noticed. In 1961, Lee signed with Bobby Robinson's Fury Records, a small, scrappy label out of New York that had a reputation for giving local talent a shot. There was no limousine, no signing bonus, no champagne. Just a contract, a handshake, and an address to show up to. What mattered was what happened next, because at that studio, Lee met the man who would change everything: Ellen Toussaint. Toussaint was young, brilliant, and already building a reputation as one of the sharpest musical minds in New Orleans. He heard something in Lee that others had only felt in passing, a natural rhythm so effortless it made complex arrangements sound like playground songs. Together they recorded a track called Ya Ya. It was built on children's rhymes, simple enough for a 5-year-old to sing along, loose enough for a jazz musician to admire. When Lee opened his mouth in that studio, the room didn't just listen, it smiled. Ya Ya exploded. It hit #1 on the R&B chart and cracked the top 10 on the national pop chart. Suddenly, the mechanic from the side street was hearing his own voice on car radios, in diners, in department stores across America. For a brief, dizzying moment, Lee Dorsey was everywhere. People who had never set foot in New Orleans were singing his words like they'd known them all their lives. But here's the thing about the music industry in the early 1960s, especially for a black artist. Without a powerful manager, without a polished image, without the machinery of a major label behind him, the system wasn't built to sustain someone like Lee. It was built to extract one hit, maybe two, then move on to the next voice, the next face, the next product. The follow-up singles didn't land, not because they were bad, they were warm, honest, full of the same charm. But the label didn't push them. The radio stations moved on. The promoters stopped calling. And just like that, the phone went quiet. It wasn't that Lee Dorsey failed, it was that the system never intended for him to last. So what did he do? He went back to his garage. And this is the part most people would frame as defeat. They'd write it as the fall, the sad chapter before the comeback. But I want you to see it differently. Because going back to that garage wasn't giving up. It was the most dignified decision a man could make. He had a wife, he had children. He had mouths that didn't care about Billboard charts, and Lee Dorsey, unlike so many artists who chased fame until it destroyed them, chose responsibility over ego. He picked up his wrench, opened the garage door, and went back to work. Think about that for a second. Think about what it takes to taste national fame, to hear your voice on the radio, to have strangers scream your name and then quietly go back to fixing carburetors on a Monday morning. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength most people will never be tested on. The years passed. 1962, 1963, 1964. Lee stayed in his shop, stayed in his neighborhood, stayed in the rhythm of ordinary life. He didn't disappear from music entirely. He still sang on weekends, still hummed under the hood of every car he touched. But the spotlight had moved on, and the industry had already filed him under one-hit wonder. What the industry didn't know was that Allen Toussaint hadn't forgotten. Toussaint had spent those years growing into one of the most important producers in American music. He'd worked with dozens of artists, he'd crafted hits for others, but something kept pulling him back to that voice, Lee's voice. The voice that didn't try, the voice that just was. So in 1965, Toussaint came back, not with promises of stardom, not with hype. He came back because he knew, deep in his bones, that Lee Dorsey had more to give, and that what Lee had, that effortless, joyful, unshakable swing, was something no other singer on earth could replicate. Picture the scene. A man walks into an auto repair garage in the middle of the afternoon. The radio is playing something forgettable. The smell of oil hangs thick. And there, bent under a hood, is one of the most naturally gifted vocalists in American music, humming to himself like it's the most normal thing in the world. Toussaint didn't need to convince Lee that he was special. He needed to convince Lee that the world deserved to hear him again. And this time, Toussaint had a plan. Lee stepped out of his garage for the second time. His hands still smelled of motor oil. His overalls still had yesterday's grease on them. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't walking toward a chance. He was walking toward the music he was always meant to make. And this time, America would have no choice but to remember his name. But the real question, the one that should sit heavy in your chest right now, is this. How long would they choose to remember? What happened next wasn't just a comeback. It was proof. The kind of proof that should have ended every argument about where Lee Dorsey belonged in the history of American music. Because between 1965 and 1969, Lee and Allen Toussaint created something that went far beyond hit singles. They built a sound, a rhythmic blueprint that would echo through funk, soul, rock, and hip-hop for the next half-century. The first single from their reunion was Ride Your Pony. It hit the R&B top 10 and crossed over into the pop charts. But the song wasn't what made it special. It was the feel. Toussaint had stripped everything down to the essentials, a deep groove, a syncopated rhythm section, and Lee's voice riding on top of it all, like a man who'd never heard the word stress in his life. It was loose, it was funky before funky was even a word the mainstream used, and it was completely, unmistakably Lee. Then came Working in the Coal Mine. Let that title sit for a moment. In the summer of 1966, while pop radio was filled with love songs and surf harmonies, Lee Dorsey released a song about going to work, about dragging yourself out of bed, punching the clock, sweating through another shift, and barely making it home before doing it all over again. It wasn't a protest song. It wasn't a ballad. It was a groove, an infectious, head-nodding, shoulder-rolling groove that made the very act of labor sound like the most danceable thing on earth. That song climbed to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was played in factories, on construction sites, in taxicabs, and at house parties from coast to coast. Working people heard themselves in it, not as victims, not as statistics, as people who showed up, did the work, and still found a reason to move their hips at the end of the day. No other artist in America was doing that, not like Lee, not with that kind of effortless joy. Holy Cow followed, another hit, another undeniable groove. Then, Get Out of My Life, Woman, a track so rhythmically inventive that musicians spent years trying to decode how something so simple could sound so deep. Then, Yes We Can, a song that turned a statement of working-class solidarity into a musical manifesto, years before the phrase became a political slogan. At his peak, Lee Dorsey was doing something no marketing team could manufacture. He was making ordinary life sound extraordinary. He didn't sing about champagne and limousines. He sang about sweat and paychecks and getting through the week. And he made it feel like the most important music in the world. Because for the people who lived those lives, it was. Think about what Adis was doing for a second. In an era when pop stars were manufactured in boardrooms and dressed in sequins, Lee Dorsey walked into the studio in work boots and sang about punching the clock. He didn't have stylists. He didn't have choreographers. He had calluses, a grin, and a voice that made you forget the difference between a Friday night and a Monday morning. Every song he recorded was a quiet act of defiance, proof that you didn't need to pretend to be someone else to make people feel something real. The respect he earned crossed every genre boundary. Rock bands studied his phrasing. Jazz players admired his swing. Funk musicians traced their rhythms directly back to the grooves Toussaint and Dorsey created in those New Orleans studios. In recording sessions across the country, engineers would reference his sound as shorthand for loose but tight, that impossible balance between precision and freedom that only a handful of artists in history have ever achieved. And when The Clash, one of the most influential bands in rock history, invited Lee to open their tour, it wasn't a novelty act. It was a statement. They called him a working-class hero who made joy look effortless. Coming from a band that built its entire identity on authenticity, there was no higher compliment. Night after night, Lee walked out in front of punk rock crowds who had never heard his name, and by the second song, they were dancing. Not out of politeness, because the groove was undeniable, because real recognizes real. And through all of it, the hits, the touring, the adulation, Lee kept his garage open. He still fixed cars between recording sessions. He still came home smelling of motor oil. He didn't hire a fleet of managers. He didn't buy a mansion. He stayed in his neighborhood, stayed in his community, stayed exactly who he'd always been. Because for Lee Dorsey, the music was never an escape from real life. It was real life, set to rhythm. But the music industry has a brutal habit. It loves you when you're selling, and it forgets you the moment the numbers stop. The 1970s came, and the sound of America changed. Disco filled the airwaves. Synthesizers replaced horn sections. The loose human groove that Lee embodied was suddenly considered old-fashioned, not because it wasn't, but because the industry had moved on to the next product. And Lee Dorsey, who had never been anyone's product, was left standing in the wake. The record deals dried up. The phone stopped ringing. Promoters who once begged for his name on the marquee now couldn't remember how to spell it. The same industry that had played his music in every city in America quietly closed the door. No farewell tour, no tribute show, no public statement, just silence. Lee went back to his garage for the last time. But this time was different. This wasn't the dignified return of a man choosing family over fame. This was a man who had given the industry everything, his voice, his joy, his authenticity, and received almost nothing in return. The royalties were a fraction of what they should have been. The publishing deals were structured to benefit everyone but the artist. The system that built its playlists on his rhythm couldn't even be bothered to send a check that covered his medical bills because Lee was getting sick. Emphysema. The disease crept in slowly, the way silence fills a room after the music stops. The lungs that had powered one of the most distinctive voices in American music were failing. Breathing became labor. Singing became memory. The man who had spent his life turning work into song was now fighting just to fill his chest with air. There is a particular cruelty in a lung disease taking a singer. It is the instrument being destroyed from within. Imagine the frustration of having melodies in your head that your body can no longer deliver. Imagine hearing your own records on the radio and knowing that the voice coming through the speakers belongs to a version of you that no longer exists. That was Lee's final years, a man trapped between the memory of sound and the reality of silence. He didn't complain. That wasn't Lee. He still showed up at his garage. He still laughed with his neighbors. He still hummed melodies, softer now, barely above a whisper, while his hands moved over engines that felt heavier every day. The tools hung on the wall, like old friends he was slowly saying goodbye to. On the 1st of December, 1986, Lee Dorsey died. He was 61 years old. There was no breaking news, no special broadcast, no moment of silence on national television, no retrospective on the evening news, no tribute concert, no industry statement mourning the loss of a pioneer. The man who had given America working in the coal mine, who had made millions of people dance, who had laid the rhythmic foundation for an entire generation of musicians, slipped out of the world the same way he had lived in it, quietly, without fuss, without demanding attention. The newspapers that covered his passing gave him a few lines for a man who had given decades. Think about the weight of that. Think about how many column inches they would have given a white artist with the same catalog, the same influence, the same legacy. Think about how differently this story would have ended if Lee Dorsey had been born into a different body, a different neighborhood, a different side of the industry's invisible line. And I need you to sit with that for a moment. Don't scroll. Don't look away. Just think about what I'm telling you. A man who hit #1 on the charts, who influenced The Clash, the Pointer Sisters, Devo, and countless others. A man whose grooves are still being sampled in music you hear today. A man Alan Toussaint, one of the greatest producers who ever lived, called irreplaceable. That man died without a headline. Now ask yourself, if Lee Dorsey had been packaged differently, if he'd had the right manager, the right label, the right image, would history have treated him this way? If he hadn't been a black mechanic from a working-class neighborhood who refused to play the fame game, would the industry have let him disappear so easily? This isn't just a sad story. This is a pattern. The music industry has a long documented history of building its empire on the talent of black artists and then discarding them when the profits slow down. Lee Dorsey's story isn't unique in that sense. What makes it sting is how completely he was erased, how thoroughly a man of his caliber was allowed to fade into a footnote. He didn't self-destruct. He didn't burn out in scandal. He simply did his work, gave his gift, and was quietly set aside by a system that never valued the man as much as it valued the revenue he generated. But here's what the industry couldn't calculate. Here's the part they always get wrong. Real music doesn't die with the man who made it. And Lee Dorsey's rhythm, that loose, joyful, unbreakable swing, was about to outlive every executive who ever signed his name on a contract. Long after the record labels moved on and the charts forgot his name, Lee Dorsey's music kept doing what it had always done, making people feel alive. It traveled through time the way only real things can, not through marketing campaigns or algorithmic playlists, but through the simple act of one person playing a song for another and watching their face light up. The Pointer Sisters took Yes We Can and turned it into Yes We Can, an anthem of unity that powered through the 1970s like a freight train of optimism. Devo took Working in the Coal Mine and brought it into the new wave era, proving that a great groove doesn't age, it just finds new bodies to move. In jazz clubs across the country, musicians reimagined his melodies with a reverence usually reserved for legends twice his fame. In hip-hop studios, producers sampled his rhythms and built entire tracks on the foundation Lee laid decades earlier, often without even knowing his name. In Europe, vinyl collectors hunted his records like artifacts from a golden age. In Japan, soul music devotees treated his catalog with the kind of care that felt more like archaeology than fandom. And in New Orleans, the city that made him and the city he never left, his legacy was sacred. Walk through the Mes Vra'in on any given night and you might still hear Yaya drifting out of an open door. Wait for a second-line parade to pass and listen. Somewhere in that brass, you'll catch the rhythm Lee Dorsey gave the world, still alive, still swinging, still refusing to stop. The critics eventually caught up. Music historians started placing his name alongside Toussaint, the Meters, and Fats Domino as one of the architects of the New Orleans sound. Writers called him the smiling philosopher of rhythm, a man who proved that music doesn't have to be serious to be profound. His records, once dismissed as simple novelty tunes, were finally recognized for what they truly were, the heartbeat of working America set to the most honest groove ever recorded. But recognition after death isn't justice. It's a receipt for something that was stolen. And that's why I'm talking to you right now. Not just to tell you a story, to ask you to do something about it. Lee Dorsey never needed Hollywood. He never needed a star on the Walk of Fame or a golden trophy on a shelf. What he needed, what every artist like him needs, is for people to say his name, to play his music, to tell his story to someone who's never heard it. Because every time we let an artist like Lee fade into silence, we're telling the world that authenticity has an expiration date, that the only artists worth remembering are the ones who played the game. And that is a lie that we have the power to correct, right here, right now, with nothing more than our voices and our choices. Remember the question I asked you at the beginning? Have you ever worked so hard your body ached and still found a reason to hum? Lee Dorsey didn't just hum, he sang. He sang for every person who ever punched a clock, wiped their brow, and kept going. He sang for you. And his song deserves to be heard one more time. So here's what I'm asking. If this story moved you, if you believe that artists like Lee Dorsey deserve more than a footnote, share this video. Write his name in the comments. Let the algorithm know that real stories still matter. Hit subscribe because next time, I'm going to tell you about another artist the industry tried to erase, and they don't deserve to be forgotten either. Some stars burn bright and fade fast. But Lee Dorsey wasn't that kind of star. His light was in the rhythm itself, steady, warm, and endlessly alive. Hollywood may have looked away, but the music never stopped. And now neither will we. This is for you, Lee. The mechanic who made America dance. We hear you, we remember. And we're not done telling your story.